Have you ever stopped to think that some coincidences are simply impossible to ignore? That there are moments in life when chance can't explain anything, and the only possible answer lies beyond what our eyes can see? Carlo Acutis' mother lived exactly that when her son passed away on October 12th, and what she discovered about that date will make you question everything you believe about destiny, purpose, and divine signs. While the world mourns the loss of promising young people every day, few stop to ask whether there's something greater behind these departures. Most just accept, grieve, and move on. But Antonia couldn't simply accept it. She needed to understand why it had to be that day, why that specific date dedicated to the Virgin of the Pilar. And when the answer finally came, it was so powerful, so profound, so transforming, that thousands around the world stopped to listen. What you're about to discover goes far beyond a simple story of faith. It's a revelation that might completely change the way you see loss, challenges, and the mysteries of life. Prepare your heart, because this isn't just another religious story. It's a call to open your eyes and recognize that God speaks to us in ways we'd never imagine, even through the deepest pain, using it as an instrument of revelation and purpose. The news struck like lightning on a sunny day. Carlo Acutis, that young man of just 15 whose faith and spirituality overflowed, had passed away on October 12th, the very day dedicated to the Virgin of the Pilar. To someone unfamiliar with this connection, it might sound like just another coincidence, you know? But for those whose hearts are open to divine messages, that detail rings like a bell that never stops sounding. Carlo's mother, Antonia Salzano, felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Imagine raising a son with so much love, watching him grow up studying the Bible, attending Mass, living the gospel so purely, and suddenly he's gone. The pain that tears through a mother's chest when she loses her child is indescribable, as if a piece of her own soul were being ripped away. But alongside that crushing pain, there was something else. A strange, almost tangible sense that this date wasn't random. Why that day? Why the day dedicated to the Virgin who, according to Christian tradition, appeared in Zaragoza upon a pillar? Antonia's heart raced as those around her tried to console her in the church where so many memories of her son lingered. Everyone knew Carlo was different. Since childhood, he had shown a devotion that impressed even the most experienced believers. While other kids his age were lost in video games and social media, he used technology to spread the word of Jesus Christ, creating websites about Eucharistic miracles and sharing testimonies of faith. But now, faced with such a sudden and devastating loss, his mother found herself caught between deep grief and spiritual questioning. Her tears fell endlessly, each one carrying not only sorrow but a silent question sent up to heaven. Was there a greater purpose behind all this? Was God trying to say something through this coincidence that seemed to shout from every corner of creation? The mystery hung in the air like a thick fog, and Antonia knew, deep within her soul, that she needed to dive into prayer and reflection to understand what was happening. In the days that followed Carlo's passing, as family and friends gathered to mourn and say their final goodbyes, that date kept echoing in her mind. October 12th, the Virgin of the Pilar, Carlo Acutis. Three elements now forever bound together in a web of meaning she still couldn't fully unravel. People came to her with words of comfort, quoting Bible verses, reminding her that Carlo was now in the arms of the Lord, part of the heavenly choir, free from all earthly suffering. And she knew that was true, her faith assured her of it. But there was something more, a deeper layer of understanding waiting to be revealed. Why had divine providence chosen that sacred day to call Carlo home? What message was hidden in that seemingly impossible timing? A mother's grieving mind works in mysterious ways, searching for meaning where there seems to be only pain. And Antonia, even in her tears and heartbreak, felt she was on the verge of discovering something extraordinary about her son's passing, something that transcended human understanding and touched the realm of the sacred and eternal. The shock of a premature loss. There are losses we can eventually come to terms with, like when someone elderly passes after a long, full life. But losing a 15-year-old child? That breaks every natural rule of existence. Antonia looked into Carlo's room and saw an entire universe suddenly interrupted. Clothes still hanging in the closet, Bible study books spread out on the desk, the computer where he spent hours documenting Eucharistic miracles from around the world. Each object was a painful reminder that this young, vibrant life had ended far too soon. Christianity teaches acceptance of God's will, trusting that He has a plan even when we don't understand it. But who said it's easy to live that truth when it's your own child who's gone? Antonia's faith was being tested in a way she never imagined possible. For years, she had taught Carlo about Jesus Christ, about prayer, about trusting in God. Now it was her turn to live by those lessons, in the hardest moment of her life. The nights were especially cruel. It was in those quiet hours that the pain became almost unbearable. Antonia would find herself flipping through photo albums, seeing baby Carlo, little Carlo, teenage Carlo, always with that smile that could light up any room. She remembered their talks about faith, the times when he'd share something new he'd discovered in the gospel. Carlo had a unique way of seeing scripture. He could connect Bible passages to everyday life in ways that even seasoned believers found remarkable. It was as if he had a direct line to God, a special gift for understanding the mysteries of spirituality. And now that gift was gone. Or was it? That question began to take root in Antonia's mind. Was Carlo's passing really an ending, or the beginning of something far greater? Her tears fell onto the photo pages as she searched for answers hidden somewhere between pain and hope. What hurt Antonia the most was thinking about all that Carlo still had ahead of him. He was so young, with so many plans, so many people still to reach with his message of faith. The testimonies he shared online had touched thousands of young Christians who felt lost in a world drifting farther from God. Carlo had planned to expand his website about Eucharistic miracles, to study more about technology so he could use it for evangelization. He dreamed of creating a global network of young people united in devotion to Jesus Christ. All of it was cut short in the blink of an eye. The leukemia that took him came fast, too fast for goodbyes, too fast for those final, comforting conversations. It was swift, brutal, devastating. Yet even in the midst of that pain and confusion, one question kept echoing in her mind: the date. That October 12th that seemed to pulse with meaning. Could it really be just coincidence? Or was God writing a story that would only make sense later on? The mystery of the sacred date. The Virgin of the Pillar isn't just another devotion in Christianity. It carries a history that goes back to the very roots of the faith. According to tradition, it was in the year 40 after Christ that the Virgin Mary appeared to the Apostle James in Zaragoza, Spain. James was discouraged, his mission facing enormous resistance, and it was in that moment of weakness that he received a heavenly visit. Mary came to him upon a pillar, bringing renewed hope and strength to continue. That pillar became a symbol of firmness, of foundation, something unshakable on which one could build. And it was on the very day dedicated to that apparition that Carlo left this world. Antonia knew this story well. She had grown up hearing about the Virgin of the Pillar, taking part in the celebrations every October 12th. But she never imagined that date would one day become so deeply personal. It was as if God had chosen the exact moment, with divine precision, to call her son, and that could not be ignored. Faith is full of signs and symbols, and the more Antonia thought about it, the more she realized she was standing before something extraordinary. The number of coincidences was too great to dismiss as mere chance. Carlo had a special devotion to the Eucharist, a deep connection to the very miracles he studied and documented. The Virgin of the Pillar, too, is closely tied to the Eucharist and to the faith in Christ's real presence in the sacrament. Carlo had devoted his short life to documenting miracles that strengthened the faith of others, especially the young. The Virgin's apparition to James had the very same purpose, to strengthen him when he needed it most. Carlo died young, at the height of his mission to spread faith. James received Mary's visit at a crucial point in his journey. The more Antonia lined up these details, the clearer it became that a divine pattern was unfolding. This wasn't the delusion of a grieving mother looking for comfort where there was none. It was a real, tangible message waiting to be understood. During the Mass held in Carlo's memory, the priest spoke about these similarities, and Antonia felt a chill run through her body. It was as if a door was opening, revealing a view that had been hidden until that moment. The questions that had been pounding in her mind began to take on a new form. It was no longer, "Why did my son die?" but "What is God trying to tell us through his passing?" You know those moments when you're reading the Bible and suddenly a verse leaps off the page and speaks directly to your heart? That's what was happening, but on a much larger scale. Carlo's death on the day of the Virgin of the Pillar wasn't the tragic end of a promising life. It was the beginning of a legacy that would touch millions. Antonia began to study more about the tradition of the Virgin of the Pillar, diving into the same biblical studies her son had loved. She spent hours in prayer, asking for discernment, and slowly, like a giant puzzle coming together, the pieces began to fit. That date wasn't chosen by accident. That specific moment on the liturgical calendar had a purpose, a meaning that reached far beyond immediate understanding. Carlo had always lived his faith as if he were on a mission, and perhaps his greatest mission began at the very moment he left this world. Death would not be the end, but the transformation. The young man who had inspired others in life was about to inspire millions for eternity. The life of faith that Carlo lived would become a light that never goes out. As the days passed and the initial pain began to make way for deeper reflection, Antonia found herself revisiting every moment of Carlo's life, like someone carefully flipping through a treasured photo album. She remembered him as a little boy, already showing a special connection to God that went far beyond what you'd expect from a child. While other boys his age could barely sit still during the sermon at church, Carlo participated actively, asking thoughtful questions about the gospel, wanting to understand every parable, every teaching of Jesus Christ. He didn't see spirituality as an obligation or a burden. It was natural to him, as natural as breathing. She remembered mornings when she'd find him doing his devotional before school, reading the Bible with a seriousness that contrasted beautifully with his youthful, lively smile. Carlo turned every day into an opportunity to live Christianity in a practical, real way. He wasn't the type who just showed up for Sunday service and that was it. No, he carried his faith everywhere, in every conversation, in every action. There was one story Antonia loved to tell, one that perfectly summed up who Carlo was. One day he came home from school and told her a classmate was going through family troubles and had completely lost his faith. Instead of simply saying, "I'll pray for him," Carlo created a personalized collection of faith testimonies that could help his friend. He spent days putting it together, selecting stories of people who had overcome crises through prayer and trust in God. And he didn't stop there. He invited the classmate to join the Bible studies he organized, always in that gentle, welcoming way that never made anyone feel uncomfortable. Within a few weeks, that young man not only returned to church but brought his entire family along. That was Carlo. He didn't just talk about faith, he lived it in a way that drew others in. His approach was modern, using examples young Christians of his generation could relate to, comparing the spiritual journey to phases of a game, explaining the Holy Trinity with analogies from technology. Simple yet brilliant, profound yet light. Carlo's dedication to the Eucharist was another thing that amazed everyone. He attended Mass whenever he could, sometimes even daily when school allowed. But what really set him apart was his project on Eucharistic miracles. He cataloged hundreds of documented cases around the world where the consecrated host showed extraordinary phenomena, physical transformations verified by scientists, unexplainable healings, signs that strengthened the faith of entire communities. He created a full website with interactive maps, photographs, historical documentation, everything organized so anyone could access it and learn. For a teenager to do that, giving up the time others spent purely on entertainment, showed a level of commitment to the gospel that is rare at any age. Antonia watched her son spend hours researching, translating texts, contacting parishes in different countries to verify information. This wasn't a hobby, it was a vocation, a calling that Carlo answered with joy and complete dedication. And the most beautiful part? He made a point to share everything with other young people, encouraging them to also use their talents to glorify God and spread the word of Jesus Christ. What impressed people most about Carlo was his ability to inspire others, especially young Christians in his community. You know those people who, when they enter a room, seem to bring light with them? That was him. Antonia remembered how he organized Bible study groups with his friends, and what was remarkable was that he did it in a way that never felt boring or outdated. Carlo spoke the language of his generation, sharing faith testimonies through videos and posts, creating digital content on Eucharistic miracles that reached thousands. He understood something many adults still struggle to grasp. Technology can be a powerful tool for spreading the gospel. While some criticized young people for always being connected, Carlo showed it was possible to use that connection for sacred purposes, for worship, for building bridges between people and God. His kindness was contagious, his smile disarmed any resistance, and his genuine devotion touched even the hardest hearts. After Carlo passed, Antonia was surprised by how many people came forward to share how he had impacted their lives. There were people from other countries who had met Carlo only virtually, through his website on Eucharistic miracles, and had returned to church because of it. One woman wrote that she had been on the verge of leaving Christianity after a family tragedy, but discovering Carlo's work and seeing a teenager so dedicated to faith made her reconsider and give it another chance. A young man sent a message saying Carlo had saved him from suicide. He was in a terrible place, hopeless, and happened upon one of Carlo's videos on faith testimonies. It changed his perspective completely. Stories like these came in by the dozens, each one more moving than the last. Antonia cried as she read them, but now her tears were different. They were the tears of a proud mother beginning to understand the magnitude of what her son had built in just 15 years of life. Carlo didn't live long in years, but he lived abundantly, in quality, in purpose, in eternal impact. In that, he lived for centuries. Carlo's legacy on social media remained alive even after his passing. The pages he created were still visited, the materials he produced continued to be shared, and new groups of young Christians were forming, inspired by his example. It was as if his voice had not been silenced by death but amplified. Antonia realized that God was using her son's story in ways beyond imagination. Parishes began using Carlo's materials in their evangelization programs. Catholic schools included his work on Eucharistic miracles in their religious studies curriculum. Youth retreats started presenting Carlo's life as an example of modern holiness. And the most remarkable part, it all happened organically without anyone pushing it, simply because the authenticity of this young man touched people profoundly. It wasn't manufactured religious marketing. It was the genuine fruit of a life lived in total devotion to Jesus Christ. Antonia saw God's hand orchestrating something magnificent, preparing the ground so that, when she finally understood the significance of the day Carlo passed, the entire world could also recognize and benefit from this revelation. The connection with the Virgin of the Pilar. Reflecting on the Virgin of the Pilar, Antonia began to see deep parallels between the story of that Marian apparition and her son's life. According to tradition, the Virgin Mary appeared to the Apostle James at a moment of discouragement and struggle, bringing hope, renewing strength, reminding him he was not alone in his mission. She appeared upon a pillar, a symbol of firmness, something unshakable on which one could build. In many ways, Carlo had been that pillar for countless people around him. How many young people renewed their faith after talking with him? How many families returned to church, inspired by his example? Antonia now understood that her son's mission was to be a point of support, someone who sustains others when everything seems to fall apart. The link with the Virgin of the Pillar was not just about the date of his death, but about these profound lessons of hope, complete surrender to God's hands, and divine trust even when we don't understand his plans. Devotion to the Virgin of the Pillar carries powerful teachings about perseverance in faith. James was on the verge of giving up when he received that heavenly visit. He doubted whether he was truly on the right path, whether his mission made sense, whether it was worth continuing to preach the gospel in such a resistant land. How often in our own faith journey do we feel the same way? We look around, see the world moving in the opposite direction of Christ's teachings, and we ask ourselves, does it even matter to keep going? Is it worth staying steadfast in prayer, in worship, in Bible study, in a life of devotion? The apparition of the Virgin of the Pillar answered that very question. Yes, it is worth it. Don't give up, because even when you can't see the results, God is working behind the scenes. Carlo lived this principle intensely. Even as a young person in a society that often ridicules authentic religion and spirituality, he remained unshaken. He stood firm like a pillar, sustained by his unwavering faith. Antonia began studying the messages associated with the Virgin of the Pillar more deeply and was amazed at how perfectly many of them resonated with Carlo's life and legacy. The Virgin brought James not only words of comfort but also a renewed mission: to build a church, a place where people could gather in God's name. Carlo, in his own way, also built churches, not of stone, but digital spaces where thousands could encounter the sacred. His website became a kind of virtual temple, where anyone, anywhere in the world, could renew their faith through documented testimonies and Eucharistic miracles. Physical churches remain important, of course, and Carlo attended his faithfully. But he understood that, in the 21st century, evangelization also needed to reach people where they are, and they are online. Just as the Virgin of the Pillar adapted her message to James' context at a specific moment in history, Carlo adapted the eternal message of the gospel to the language and tools of his generation. That is spiritual genius. It's understanding that the essence of Christianity does not change, but the ways we communicate it must evolve. The moment of revelation. It was during one of those nights of deep prayer, when Antonia surrendered completely to her search for answers, that understanding finally came like a ray of light piercing the darkness. She sat before the image of the Virgin of the Pillar, the Bible open in her lap, her heart still bleeding from her son's absence, when everything began to make sense. Carlo had not left that day by chance. He was called precisely on October 12th because his earthly mission was complete and his heavenly mission was just beginning. Antonia realized that God, in his infinite wisdom, had orchestrated every detail of that life and that departure. Just as the Virgin of the Pillar appeared upon a pillar to strengthen James in his evangelizing mission, Carlo would now be an eternal pillar of inspiration for all who seek to live Christianity authentically. The tears that fell now were different. They were no longer just of pain, but of gratitude and understanding. The revelation didn't strike like thunder, but settled as a soft, unshakable certainty in Antonia's heart. It was as if all the pieces of the puzzle had finally snapped into place. The leukemia that took Carlo so quickly was not divine cruelty, but the fulfillment of a time set even before he was born. Every day of his life was meticulously planned for maximum impact. 15 years may seem short to us, but to God, who sees eternity, it was more than enough time for Carlo to plant seeds that will continue to grow for generations. The spirituality Carlo radiated in life would not be extinguished by death. On the contrary, it would be multiplied and spread across the world through the testimonies of faith he left behind. The date of his passing was no coincidence. It was God's signature. It was God saying to the world, "Pay attention to this young man, because he is special, and he carries a message that must echo through eternity." October 12th now held a dual meaning: the day of the Virgin of the Pillar and the day Carlo Acutis entered heavenly glory to continue his mission from another plane. Antonia remembered a conversation with Carlo just months before he passed. They were returning from a service when he suddenly said, "Mom, if I die young, don't be sad. It means my work here is done and God has something greater for me to do in heaven." At the time, it had chilled her to the bone. What child talks about their own death with such calm? She even gently scolded him, telling him he shouldn't think about such things. But now, revisiting that memory, she understood. Carlo knew. Somehow, mysteriously, he knew his time was limited and was at peace with it. It wasn't a morbid premonition. It was deep spiritual awareness. He was someone so connected with God that he could accept divine plans without resistance. That understanding brought immense comfort to Antonia. Her son wasn't taken from her against God's will. He was promoted, elevated, called to a higher mission. And the choice of that specific date was God's way of stamping that truth so no one could doubt it. Carlo Acutis is a divine gift to humanity, a pillar of faith strategically planted in the history of modern Christianity.